They came on a Tuesday, which Earl Decker always said was the worst possible day for anything to go wrong on a farm. Monday you could blame the weekend. Wednesday was the hump. Things improved from there. Thursday and Friday had momentum behind them. Saturday and Sunday the world was supposed to rest. But Tuesday sat in the middle of everything like a bad tooth you couldn't stop probing with your tongue. Nothing good ever started on a Tuesday, and nothing terrible that started on a Tuesday ever ended quickly. The ship came down at 3:17 in the morning. Earl knew the exact time because he'd been awake, same as he was every night this past month, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and the ledger open in front of him. The numbers in the ledger didn't change no matter how long he stared at them. The bank wasn't going to change its mind. The county wasn't going to forgive the back taxes. And the 43 acres his grandfather had broken from rock and red clay in 1931 weren't going to suddenly start turning a profit just because Earl Decker needed them to. He'd sold the tractor in March, sold the pigs in April. The chickens went in May, every one of them. Even the Rhode Island Reds his daughter Clara had named when she was 6 years old. He'd sold the second truck, the irrigation equipment, the antique hand plow that a man from a museum in Nashville had wanted for years, and that Earl had always refused to part with. He'd sold almost everything, and now there was Bessie. Bessie was a Hereford cow, 12 years old, broad across the shoulder and slow in her movements in the way that old animals get slow. Not sick, not fading, just deliberate. She had a blaze of white down the center of her face, and one ear that flopped outward at an angle that made her look perpetually skeptical. Earl's wife, Margaret, had named her the year they bought the calf. The same year Clara was born, and when Margaret passed 4 winters ago from the cancer, Bessie had been the one who walked to the fence every morning and stood there while Earl drank his coffee and did not say a word. She was the last animal on the property. The auction house wanted $800 for her. Earl kept finding reasons to postpone the call. He heard the sound first, not an engine sound, nothing so mechanical as that. It was more like the air pressure changing, like the moment before a bad storm, when the birds go quiet and the hair on your arms stands up and the world holds its breath. Earl set down his coffee mug. He went to the window. The light was the color of old copper, amber green, coming from somewhere above the barn. It pulsed, slow and rhythmic, like something breathing. It lit the yard in colors that had no business being there at 3 in the morning, throwing long shadows off the fence posts that stretched toward the house like fingers. Earl stood at the window for what felt like a long time. Then he went to the closet, took down his grandfather's .30-06 rifle, and went outside. The night air hit him cold and clean. The sky overhead was wrong, not clouded over, just wrong. A blankness where the stars should have been, as though something enormous was sitting up there drinking the light. The amber glow was coming from behind the barn, and as Earl rounded the corner of the building, walking along the fence line with the rifle held down at his side, he saw it. The ship was bigger than his barn. Not by a little. It was perhaps 4 times the size. A disc-shaped thing that hovered with its belly maybe 15 feet off the ground, impossibly still, making no sound except for that subsonic pressure that Earl felt in his back teeth and his sternum. Its underside was covered in patterns that shifted and rearranged themselves as he watched. Geometric shapes that almost organized into something recognizable and then broke apart again. A single column of that amber-green light descended from its center, touching the ground in the middle of the pasture. Bessie was standing in the beam. She stood the way she always stood, foursquare, solid, that slightly skeptical ear cocked outward. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't trying to run. She was standing in the light with her eyes open. And the light was doing something to her, picking her coat out in extraordinary detail, making her look almost sculpted. The way things look in the last moment before something takes them from you. "Hey," Earl said. His voice came out flat and quiet. The pasture swallowed it. The ship didn't respond. Earl raised the rifle, put the barrel toward the ship's underside, and fired once. The shot hit something and stopped. Not ricocheted, stopped. The sound of it swallowed the same way his voice had been swallowed, absorbed into the ship's surface with barely a ripple. The amber light pulsed once, harder than before, and Earl stumbled back a step from the pressure of it. His ears rang. Bessie looked at him. He'd spent 12 years reading that animal's face. He knew what her hunger looked like, and her contentment, and the mild irritation she expressed when he was late with her morning grain. The look she gave him now was different from any of those. It was almost like grief. "No," Earl said. "No, you don't." He grabbed the fence rail with one hand and pulled himself over it, landing in the wet grass of the pasture. The light was warm and the pressure was enormous. He felt it against his face like a held breath, felt it trying to push him back. He walked into it, anyway. He got within 10 feet of Bessie before something in the air thickened. It wasn't a wall, nothing so simple as a wall. It was more like walking into water, everything slowing, his legs moving, but the ground not coming any closer the way it should. Earl leaned into it with his whole body the way he'd leaned into wind during bad storms, driving a pickup down a county road in a January gale, the kind of lean that was mostly stubbornness and a refusal to concede. He moved another 3 feet, Bessie lowed at him. Low and rumbling, the sound she made on cold mornings. "I know," Earl said. "I'm coming." He was close enough now to touch her, and he reached out his hand and put it on the side of her neck, in the place where the white patch of her blaze ran down into the redder fur of her shoulder. She was warm. She smelled like grass and the mineral dust of the pasture and all the years of early mornings at the fence, when neither of them had anything to say. The light intensified. Earl felt his boots leave the ground. The thing that happened next, Earl would never be able to describe accurately to the people who eventually came to ask him about it. The closest he could get was this. It was like the moment when you're on side of a decision and then you're on the other side of it. And the crossing happened so fast you couldn't trace the seam. He was in the pasture. Then he was somewhere else. The somewhere else was big and lit in that same amber green and smelled of nothing. Not a clean nothing, like mountain air, but an absolute nothing, a scrubbed nothing, as though every molecule of scent had been processed out of the atmosphere and replaced with a careful approximation of breathable air. The floor was smooth under Earl's boots. Smooth and faintly warm, the same way the light had been warm in the pasture. Bessie was beside him, her broad Hereford shoulder against his arm. They were inside the ship. Earl took stock of himself in the way his father had taught him. Count what you have, figure out what you need, don't spend time on what you can't use. He had the rifle. He had the clothes on his back, work shirt, denim jeans, barn boots, the canvas jacket he'd grabbed without thinking on the way out. He had his pocket knife and his phone, and, though it seemed absurd, the front door key that he kept on a carabiner on his belt loop, because Clara kept after him about locking the house. He did not have a plan. The room was round and seamless, maybe 40 feet across, the walls curving up and inward to meet overhead in a shape like the inside of an egg. The patterns that had moved on the ship's underside also moved here, flowing across the walls in rivers of dim light, geometric and unhurried. There were structures in the room that Earl's brain wanted to call furniture, and that his gut knew were something else. Shapes that almost implied sitting or standing, or the storage of objects, and that probably served entirely different purposes. There was no dust. There were no visible seams in the floor. There was no sound except for the ambient hum of whatever kept this thing aloft. There was also emerging from a passage in the far wall that had not been there a moment before, one of them. Earl had expected something from the movies. Gray skin, large heads, black eyes. What he got was different enough that he spent a full 3 seconds just trying to parse what he was looking at. The creature was roughly bipedal but not symmetrically. It had 2 limbs it used for locomotion, and a variable number of upper appendages that shifted in number and position as it moved, somewhere between 4 and 7 at any given moment, retracted or extended according to some logic Earl couldn't determine. Its skin, if skin was the right word, was the color and texture of wet slate, and it moved with a sound like dry leaves. It was about Earl's height, maybe 6 feet, and it moved toward them with what Earl could only describe as confidence. Not aggression, not caution, but the particular ease of a creature that had done this before and expected it to go a specific way. It stopped about 12 feet from them. For a moment, nothing happened. Then it extended 2 of its appendages toward Bessie, in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive, and made a sound that was not quite language and not quite not language. A complex harmonic that Earl felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. Earl put himself between the creature and Bessie. He didn't think about it. He just did it. The creature stopped. Its appendages retracted somewhat. It produced the harmonic again, a different configuration, and Earl had the distinct impression that it was trying to communicate something that translated roughly as, "This is not your concern. Please move." "No," Earl said. He was aware that no was probably not translatable. He was aware that the rifle in his hands was a proven ineffective against whatever the ship's hull was made of. He was aware that he was a 61-year-old farmer in a barn jacket standing inside an alien spacecraft at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. which was the worst possible day for this to happen, and that by any reasonable assessment, he did not have a single card to play. Earl Decker had not survived 61 years of farming by waiting for a reasonable assessment to improve. He sat down on the floor, right there on the smooth, warm floor of the alien ship. He sat down next to Cece the way he sat next to her in the barn during difficult calvings, or on the evenings after Margaret died when he needed somewhere to be. And he put one hand on her flank and he settled in. The creature made a new sound. This one was shorter, sharper. Earl thought it might be surprise. It took a step toward him. Earl didn't move. Bessie shifted her weight to lean slightly toward him, the way she always did. The creature stopped again, extended an appendage and made a gesture that probably meant stand up or you need to go or, this is unprecedented in my operational parameters. Earl couldn't be sure which. He met whatever passed for its eyes. There were sensory clusters on the front of its head that functioned like eyes, multi-lobed, faintly luminescent, and he held that contact and did not stand up. I'm not leaving without her, he said. You can do whatever you want about it. He leaned against Bessie's warm side. She lowed once and then was quiet. The creature stood there for what felt like several minutes. Then it turned and went back through the passage in the wall. Earl waited. He counted his breaths the way he'd counted them during the bank meetings that had gone badly, during the auction where the tractor went for $400 less than he'd hoped, during the night after Margaret's funeral when Clara had gone back to the city and the house was empty and too quiet in every room. He breathed and he waited and he kept his hand on Bessie's flank. The patterns on the shifted in ways that might have been agitation or might have been simple processing. He had no way to know. Twice he heard harmonics from other parts of the ship. Complex exchanges that sounded argumentative in their structure without him being able to say why. Once something in the walls made a sound like a question. The ship moved. He felt it in his inner ear, tilting slightly and then correcting, as though someone upstairs was having a disagreement about which direction to point. Then 3 of them came back. The first creature, plus 2 more. These 2 were larger, broader in the torso, more appendages, a different texture to their slate-gray surfaces. They positioned themselves in a loose configuration around Earl and Bessie that was clearly meant to be imposing, and that objectively was imposing. And they all produced harmonics simultaneously. A 3-part thing that made Earl's nose bleed a little. He wiped it on his sleeve. Okay, he said. He reached into the chest pocket of his canvas jacket and took out the photograph he kept there. He'd put it there months ago for no particular reason he could name, just moved it from a drawer to his pocket one morning, and kept it there the way you keep a worry stone. It was a photograph of this property, of the pasture and the barn and the hill behind, and the old oak at the fence line, taken by Margaret on a day in early October years ago, when the light was golden and the grass was still green, and Bessie, or Bessie's mother, or her mother's mother, some Herod ancestor, was standing in the middle of it all like she'd been placed there deliberately. A picture of a small farm on a Tuesday in October that meant nothing to anyone outside this family. Earl held it out toward the 3 creatures. They went still. Not cautious still. Not threat-assessing still. Just still. The way living things go still when something unexpected enters their processing. The largest of the 3, the new one, the broadest, extended an appendage and touched the edge of the photograph. Not taking it, just touching the surface of it. It made a sound Earl had not heard before. The other 2 responded with sounds he had not heard before either. Earl didn't know what they were saying. He suspected they didn't have a word for what they were saying, any more than he could have explained in a language he didn't speak what it meant. To own a land that your grandfather broke by hand. To get up every morning and feed an animal that your dead wife had named. To sit in a kitchen at 3 in the morning unable to sell the last thing, because selling it meant the story was over. The largest creature withdrew its appendage from the photograph. All 3 of them made a different harmonic together, a chord that might have been deliberation or consensus, or something for which Earl had no equivalent concept. Then the largest one moved to the passage, and the other 2 followed, and Earl was alone again with Bessie and the moving walls. He sat for a while longer. He wasn't sure how long. The ship's interior had no windows and he couldn't see the sky. At some point he realized his coffee was still on the kitchen table getting cold, and the thought was so ordinary, so specifically and stubbornly his own life, that he almost laughed. Bessie turned her head and looked at him with that skeptical ear cocked. I know, he said. I don't have a plan either. The floor hummed. Then the amber-green column of light opened again beneath them, and Earl felt the same pressure in reverse. Not pulling him up, but letting him down gently. The way you lower something you've decided not to break. The pasture grass was wet against his boots. The night air was cold and clean after the processed nothing smell of the ship. The stars were back, the whole spread of them. The way they looked from a place far enough from city lights to remember that the sky was actually like this. Bessie stood beside him and snorted. Overhead, the amber light went out. The pressure released. There was no roar of engines, no dramatic departure. Just the sense of something enormous deciding it was done with this place. A shift in the air. And then the ship was simply not there in the way it had been. Gone. Earl stood in his pasture in the dark and looked up at where it had been and listened to the frogs starting back up at the creek. He put his hand on Bessie's neck. She lowed once. Low and quiet, the cold morning sound. The photograph was still in his other hand. He looked at it for a moment in the starlight. The barn, the hill, the October light, the Hereford in the pasture, and then he put it back in his chest pocket. He walked Bessie back to the barn, got her settled with fresh water and a scoop of grain, and then he went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table with his cold coffee and his open ledger. He sat there for a while. He was still sitting there when the sky started getting gray in the east, and Clara's number came up on his phone, which was unusual because Clara didn't call this early. He answered it. "Dad," she said, and her voice had the particular tension that meant she'd been awake a while herself. "Are you okay? I don't know, I just had this feeling." "I'm fine," Earl said. "Is Bessie okay?" He paused. "Yeah, Bessie's fine, good." He could hear her exhaling. "Good, okay. Sorry to call so early." "Don't apologize for calling." There was a quiet between them that wasn't an uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet you can have with someone when you've known each other long enough. "Dad," Clara said, "don't sell her." "I'm working on it," Earl said. He closed the ledger. He looked out the window at the barn, where the doors were closed and the light was just beginning to find the weather vane on the roof. He thought about the bank. He thought about the 43 acres his grandfather had taken from rock and red clay. He thought about the photo in his pocket. He drank the cold coffee. What happened next happened slowly, the way anything real happens slowly when you're inside it and can only see it clearly from the other side. But here is the shape of it. 3 days after the Tuesday in question, a man named Dr. Thomas Avery from something called the Convergence Research Institute in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, knocked on Earl's door. He was polite, mid-50s, wore clothes that were too clean for a farm visit. He said he'd picked up anomalous readings on equipment he ran 3 counties over. Equipment that he ran because he was one of 12 people in the continental United States who had been waiting for precisely such a reading for the better part of 30 years. Earl let him in and gave him coffee. Dr. Avery said he had questions. Earl said he had answers, but he wanted to understand a few things first. Specifically, he wanted to understand why they'd come for Bessie, Doctor. Avery said he didn't know that part yet, but he had a theory. He said, carefully, the way scientists say things they're not entirely sure of yet, that there were patterns in reported contact events going back decades. And one of the consistent patterns was that the contacts clustered around regions of intact multi-generational agricultural land, not big industrial operations, small family farms, continuous use, the kind where the same families had worked the same soil for 3 or 4 generations. The theory, still unproven, was that such places accumulate something in their biological and geological layers, in the soil microbiome, in the long complex relationship between working animals and working land. That was of interest. Not randomly. Systematically. They weren't trying to take Bessie, Earl said slowly. Or not just Bessie. No, Dr. Avery said. I think Bessie may have been representative. A kind of sample from a kind of system. The way you'd take a core sample from old-growth forest. What's the system, Doctor? Avery turned his coffee cup in his hands. This farm. Everything that's happened on it. Everything that's accumulated. Earl looked out the window at the barn. That's worth something, he said. I believe it may be worth a great deal, Dr. Avery said, to the right people. They talked for 4 hours, Doc. Avery came back the following week with 2 colleagues, and they walked the property, and readings and samples, all of which they paid Earl for on a day rate that was more than fair. The Institute had a preservation program for what they called contact-adjacent sites, places that had demonstrated anomalous contact events of the kind that Earl's farm had demonstrated. Places where continuing the agricultural operation intact was considered scientifically significant. The program paid an annual site maintenance stipend. It was not a fortune, it was enough. Earl didn't need a fortune. He needed enough. He called the bank. He made an arrangement. He did not call the auction house. The autumn came the way it always came in this part of Tennessee, slow and golden, the sumac on the hillsides going red while the oaks were still green, the mornings sharp and the afternoons warm. Earl got up every morning and drank his coffee at the fence. And Bessie came across the pasture and stood there the way she always did. That skeptical ear cocked, her breath showing white in the cold air. He didn't tell many people about the Tuesday in question. He told Clara, eventually, on a Sunday in November, when she came down for the holiday, and they walked the fence line together the way they used to when she was a kid. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was not something Clara had ever been naturally good at. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" she asked. "Later," Earl said. "At the time I was mostly annoyed." Clara laughed, surprised out of it, the laugh she'd gotten from her mother. "That's very you, Dad." "It was a Tuesday," Earl said, as if that explained it. And for the two of them, with their shared history of this land and this family's stubborn tenure on it, it mostly did. He didn't tell Dr. Avery about the photograph. Some things you keep, some things you carry in your chest pocket, worn soft at the edges, and you don't put them in a report. But sometimes in the evenings, when the light was right and the work was done, Earl would sit on the fence rail and look out over the 43 acres and think about the ship, about the three creatures, and the way the largest one had touched the photograph without taking it, about the consensus harmonic they'd made, the one he had no word for. He thought about what it meant that something had come from, wherever they'd come from, crossing whatever distance, and landed specifically here, on this particular piece of ground, on this ordinary farm on a Tuesday in October. He thought about what they must have seen when they looked at it, what they'd read in the soil and the biology and the generations of careful, difficult, unglamorous work. He thought about what it meant that they'd decided to leave. Earl was not an arrogant man. He did not think he had won anything exactly. He didn't think a 61-year-old farmer sitting down on a spaceship floor with a cow and a photograph had persuaded an advanced civilization of anything. That seemed like too clean a story, and real things were never that clean. What he thought was closer to this, that something had come expecting to take and had found, instead, something it hadn't expected to find. A resistance that wasn't a threat. A claim that wasn't a weapon. A man who sat down and stayed put and said, "I'm not leaving without her," with no leverage in the world except the peculiar human conviction that some things are simply not negotiable. He thought about his grandfather breaking this land. He thought about his father working it. He thought about Margaret naming the calf. He thought about Clara, who lived in a city now and worked in an office but who called on mornings when she had a feeling, and who said don't sell her, and meant, don't let the story end. He thought that if the creatures had read any of that in the photograph, in the farm, in the old Hereford cows, standing foursquare in an alien light beam with that skeptical ear cocked, if they'd read any of it at all, then they had encountered something that their instruments probably couldn't categorize. Not intelligence exactly. Not strength. Something older than either. The stubbornness of things that intend to continue. The sky above the farm was clear and full of stars on the best evenings. Earl had always known the stars were there, had always looked up at them, the way you look at something enormous that you know is real and can't entirely hold in your mind. He looked at them differently now. Not with fear exactly. Not with the breathless wonder of the science fiction stories he'd read as a kid. With something more like acknowledgement. The kind you give a neighbor across a fence line. Someone you don't know well. Whose purposes you don't entirely understand. Who has established they know you exist. That'll do, Earl thought. That'll do for now. Bessie came to the fence and pressed her broad, white-blazed face against his shoulder. He gave her the grain from his coat pocket, the handful he always kept there, and she ate it with the particular deliberate satisfaction of an old animal that has learned to take good things as they come. The stars turned overhead. The farm was quiet. The 43 acres sat under the dark sky in the way they had sat for 90 years. Held and worked and kept and continued. The second time they came, Earl was ready. Not with weapons, not with plans. He'd established the futility of those the first time around. But he'd spent the intervening 8 months thinking about what had actually happened on that Tuesday in October, turning it over the way he turned problems in the field, looking at it from every angle until he understood its shape. He'd talked to Dr. Avery about the clustering patterns. He'd read what there was to read about the other sites, the ones in Kansas and Kentucky and northern Ontario, and the consistency of what happened there. They always came for something specific. They always took it cleanly, if they could. They rarely encountered resistance, because resistance, as Dr. Avery observed, requires someone to stay. Most people, when confronted with something that size and power and strangeness, leave, which is a reasonable and intelligent thing to do. Earl did not think he was smarter than the people who left. He just thought there was a different calculus available. If you happen to have less to lose than them, or happen to have the particular kind of stubbornness that doesn't know how to calculate the odds before it's already done the thing. The second ship was different from the first. It was larger for one. It didn't fit over the barn the way the first one had. It sat over the whole south end of the property. A presence more the shape, the amber light coming from too many sources to track. It came on a Thursday, which Earl took as marginally better than Tuesday, and it came in the afternoon, which meant he saw it coming from the tractor shed where he was repairing fence posts. He watched it descend. He thought about going inside, calling Dr. Avery, barricading the house. He thought about all the things a person did when they were trying to protect themselves. Then he wiped the grease off his hands on a shop rag and walked out into the south pasture and stood there in the open. There were more of them this time. 7, maybe 8. Their exact number difficult to establish, given the way their appendages moved. They came down in the beam and arrayed themselves in a configuration that Earl, by now, had thought enough about to read. It was not an aggressive configuration. It was formal, the way you arranged yourself when you were coming to negotiate. The largest of them, Earl thought it was the same largest one from before, though he had no way to be sure, produced a harmonic. Earl reached into his chest pocket. He took out the photograph. He held it up. The large one was still for a moment. Then it produced something from wherever its kind produced things. A surface, thin and flexible, covered in the shifting geometric patterns from the ship's walls. It held this out toward Earl the way Earl had held the photograph, an offering returned. A language of objects, of things that stand for other things, for accumulation and continuity, and the claim staked by staying. Earl looked at what they were offering him. He couldn't read it. He had no idea what the patterns meant, what they recorded, what knowledge or coordinates or maps to wherever they'd come from were encoded in those flowing lines. He would give it to Dr. Avery, and the Institute would spend years with it and arrive at partial answers and more questions, which was how it usually went with things worth knowing. But he understood the gesture. He reached out and took it. The large one took the photograph. They stood there for a moment in the south pasture of Earl Decker's farm, each holding something that belonged to the other's world, both of them surrounded by their respective versions of backup. Neither one entirely sure what they were doing, but both apparently willing to stay and find out. "You came back," Earl said. The harmonic the large one produced was not language. It was, however, unmistakably, in some fundamental sense that Earl felt in his chest rather than parsed in his brain, an answer. Yes, and then, because you stayed. Or maybe he read that in himself, in the 43 acres around him, in the old cow, watching from the barn door with that perpetually skeptical ear. Maybe that was just Earl, having a conversation with his own life. He'd been doing that for 61 years, and it had never steered him entirely wrong. The second visit lasted 3 hours. There were no incidents. Several of the creatures walked the fence line in the way that Dr. Avery, when Earl described it later, said sounded like a survey, a systematic mapping of the biological record of the land. 2 of them spent a long time at the old oak, at the property corner, the one his grandfather had left standing when he cleared the field because it was too big to move and too old to cut. Earl showed them the spring at the north end of the property, the way his father had shown it to him, the way his grandfather had probably shown his father. Here is the water. Here is where it comes from. Here is what has kept this place. At the end, the large one produced the harmonic Earl had heard on the first visit, the consensus chord, the one that sounded like a decision being made. This time there were more of them making it. More voices in the chord. The beam withdrew. The presence lifted. Earl stood in his south pasture and watched the sky return to its normal state, and thought that he'd just conducted the strangest negotiation in the history of this or any farm, and that he still had no idea what he'd agreed to. He called Clara that evening. "They came back," he said. A silence. "Are you okay?" "Fine. Bessie's fine. The farm's fine." "Dad," her voice had the tone that meant she was sitting down. "What do you think they want?" Earl looked out the window at the dark pasture, at the fence line, at the old oak he could just make out against the sky. "I think," he said slowly, "they want to know how we did it." "Did what?" "This." He gestured at the window, at the farm, at the whole stubborn fact of it. "Stayed right here in one place for a long time. Through everything. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's not special, she said. Lots of people do that. Yeah, Earl said. I know. He thought that might be exactly the point. That there was something in the unremarkable, ordinary, grinding persistence of it. The getting up every morning, the feeding the animals, the mending the fences, the sitting with the dead and the newborn alike, the paying the bills, and losing the money and finding a way to stay. That was somehow legible to something that had crossed whatever distances they'd crossed, looking for exactly that, not the exceptional, the continuous, the particular kind of miracle that doesn't know it's a miracle, because it's too busy doing the work. Don't sell the farm, Clara said. I wasn't going to, Earl said. He poured himself a bourbon, a Tuesday bourbon, he thought, because now Tuesday had different associations. He sat at the kitchen table with the flexible surface the large creature had given him. Its patterns still shifting gently in the light, recording something or saying something or simply existing in the patient way that things from very far away exist when they're trying to be understood. He put the photograph on the table beside it. The farm on a Tuesday in October. The pasture, the barn, the hill, the oak, the Hereford in the field. The light that Margaret had caught in it, the way she could catch things. The particular gift she'd had for showing you what was already there. 90 years of staying in one place and meaning it. He thought that maybe that was the story the creatures were reading in the soil, and the biology and the old bones of this land. Not the drama of it. There wasn't much drama. Mostly there was just work and weather, and the long, ordinary arithmetic of a life. The story was quieter than that. The story was the fence, mended for the 100th time. The story was the spring that never dried up. The story was the cow at the fence in the morning, and the man who got up to meet her. The story was that this place, this small, unremarkable place on a county road in Tennessee, had been loved into continuing by the stubborn, ordinary love of people who got up every day and did not leave. Earl drank his bourbon. Outside, Bessie was quiet in the barn. The stars were out. The 43 acres lay under the sky in the dark, doing what they'd been doing for 90 years, which was existing with particular patient intensity of things that are being kept. Whatever was coming next, more ships, more questions, more visits in the amber light. Earl Decker was going to be here when it arrived. He was going to get up in the morning and drink his coffee and walk to the fence. He was going to stay. Spring came late that year, the way spring in Tennessee sometimes does. Teasing at February, retreating into sleep through March. Finally arriving in April as if it had been planning to all along and simply took its time about it. Earl put in a kitchen garden he hadn't kept in years. Not a big one. Just tomatoes and beans and the sweet corn his wife had always grown along the south fence. The variety whose name he couldn't remember, but whose seeds he'd saved in a mason jar in the pantry for going on 7 years since the last time they'd planted it. He turned the soil himself with a borrowed rototiller, working the rows the way his father had worked them, drawing the beds with a string line and a couple of stakes, taking a pleasure in the geometry of it that he hadn't expected. Dr. Avery came back 3 more times before summer, each visit longer than the last. He brought colleagues with expertise that Earl didn't entirely follow. A soil biologist, a woman who studied what she called emergent biological systems. A quiet young man who did something with atmospheric data that apparently meant something significant about the nights the ships had come. They walked the property and took measurements, and sat at Earl's kitchen table, drinking his coffee and talking in the careful language of people who were trying to be precise about something they didn't have precise words for yet. What they were trying to be precise about was this: that Earl's farm, along with 7 other sites in North America and 11 internationally, appeared to be part of a pattern of contact that was not random, that the pattern implied intent, that the intent, as best they could reverse engineer it from the data, was observational rather than extractive, that whatever the visitors were taking from these places, they were taking in the way you take a reading, not in the way you take a resource. They're studying us, Earl said. They're studying places, Doctor, Avery said, with the precision of a man who had learned to be careful with language. Specifically, places where the relationship between human occupation and biological systems has been continuous and long-term. Old farms, old forests, old fishing grounds, places where human presence hasn't erased the natural record but has become part of it. So what's the question? Earl asked. What are they trying to answer? Dr. Avery turned his coffee cup in his hands. He did this often, Earl had noticed, a habitual gesture, the hands working while the mind assembled the words. We think, he said. They're trying to answer whether it's possible. Whether what's possible. What you do here. What your grandfather did. What the people at all these sites do. The coexistence, I suppose, is the closest word. The human occupation that doesn't ultimately consume its own ground. They seem to want to know if it's real, if it persists, if it's replicable, or if it's exceptional. If it's something that happens once in a very long while and then is gone. Earl looked out the window at the bean rows. The late April light was long and clean across the garden. It's not exceptional, he said. There are people doing this all over. Yes, Dr. Avery said. That appears to be what they're finding, and I think, Doctor, Avery said slowly, that they find it surprising. In the way you find surprising a thing you expected not to exist. Earl thought about that for a long time after Avery and his colleagues had gone. He thought about it while he strung the beans and staked the tomatoes. He thought about it while he walked the fence line in the evenings. Bessie following at a comfortable distance, the way she did, when the weather was nice and she had no particular business, but company suited her. It was surprising to them, the persistence, the continuity. The fact that something as small and as fragile as a family on 43 acres could hold together rang long enough to become something you could read in the geological record, in the soil chemistry, in the long, patient testimony of the land. He thought about all the ways it almost hadn't held. The drought year when the creek ran thin for 3 months, and the pasture went brown, and his father hauled water from town in the truck. The year the bank had called his grandfather's note, and his grandfather had made a trip to town that nobody talked about, after which the note was somehow extended. The year Earl himself had come closest to selling, before the Institute, before the ships. Standing in this same kitchen with the ledger open and the numbers not adding up, and something in him simply refusing to make the call. What kept things going was not grand, it was not heroic. It was the sum of 10,000 small acts of stubbornness by people who mostly didn't think of themselves as stubborn. They would have called it responsible, or practical, or just what you did. You got up, you fed the animals, you mended what broke, you stayed. He thought about what it would look like from very far away. From a distance where the full 90 years were visible at once. The way you could look down from a hill and see the whole pattern of the fields that you couldn't see when you were walking them. From that distance, what would this farm look like? What would all the farms like it look like? A signal, maybe. In the long noise of human history, all the clearing and burning and depleting and moving on, in all of that noise, these places where people stayed and tended and kept, these places would stand out. A different pattern, a different signal. Something saying, here, this is different. This is what happens when a species decides, in at least some of its instances, to put down roots deep enough to matter. He thought about the creatures studying these sites. He thought about what they must be trying to understand. Not human civilization in the large, not the cities and the wars and the technology, but this, the small-scale decision, the daily choice, the particular kind of faith, if that was the right word, that said this ground is worth keeping. Maybe they were asking whether it was a fluke, whether the continuity was an accident of circumstance rather than something repeatable, something that could be argued to be a property of the species, rather than of a few lucky individuals in a few lucky places. Earl thought about Jay Wilde, a beef farmer in England he'd read about on one of the Institute's shared reading lists, who'd inherited his father's cattle farm and couldn't bring himself to send the animals to slaughter, and had found a sanctuary for all 73 of them and started over. He thought about the Johnstone family in New Zealand, who'd been running the same land for 3 generations. He thought about the prison farm program in Canada that people had gone to jail to protect. Maybe the signal was this, that in a species capable of tremendous destruction, the impulse toward care kept reasserting itself, kept finding people willing to carry it forward, kept producing, in unlikely circumstances, in insufficient margins, in ledgers that didn't add up, in farms that should have been sold and parcels that should have been developed, and animals that should have been auctioned off, kept producing people who said no, not this one, not yet, I'm not done here. The sun went down over the hill, the evening star came up. Bessie stood at the fence and regarded Earl with that perpetually skeptical ear. What? He said. She lowed. The cold morning sound, even in April, he gave her the grain from his pocket. She ate it with her eyes half closed, the particular expression of an old animal enjoying a simple thing. Earl leaned on the fence rail and watched the first stars appear. He was thinking about his grandfather, who'd broken this land with a mule team and a prayer, and a stubbornness that his family still talked about with a kind of reverence, the way you talk about a quality that was tested hard and came through. He was thinking about his father, who'd kept it through a depression and a war and the long, slow economic strangulation of small farming in America. He was thinking about Margaret, who'd known how to name a calf and how to catch the light in a photograph and how to leave something behind that was worth finding. He was thinking about Clara, who'd left and kept calling, who said don't sell her, who had the particular gift of knowing what mattered even from a distance. He was thinking about himself, sitting on the floor of a spaceship at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, with his hand on an old cow's flank, doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was stay. From very far away, he thought, this probably looked like something worth studying. He was okay with that. A satellite moved across the sky from west to east, slow and steady, winking every few seconds. Earl watched it go. He thought about all the things moving overhead that he couldn't see. All the instruments and observers and whatever they were that were tracking the patterns in the old places. Reading the long testimony of the kept ground. He thought, we're here, not triumphantly, not with flags or speeches or the kind of declaration that gets carved in stone. Just, we're here. We've been here. We intend to be here. We are the kind of thing that stays. Bessie finished the grain and turned back toward the barn. Earl pushed off the fence rail and followed her in to do the evening check. Water, hay, latches. The work that ended every day, the same way it had ended every day for 90 years on this land. He did it carefully and completely, the way his father had taught him, the way he intended to teach it if Clara ever came back to stay, or her children after her. The barn smelled of hay and cattle and the particular warm dark that barns smell of. Earl pulled the door closed against the night air and walked back to the house across the wet April grass, the stars above him and the lamp burning in the kitchen window, and the 43 acres lying quiet around him in the dark, doing what they'd been doing since his grandfather first turned the soil, holding on, accumulating, persisting, adding their slow, patient weight to the record of things that endured. He went inside and poured himself a small bourbon and sat at the kitchen table. The flexible surface from the second visit was in a case at the Institute now, being studied by people with the right instruments. But he'd made a copy of it, or rather Dr. Avery had made a copy for him, a photograph of its surface that caught the patterns in a particular light. He kept it in the ledger between the most recent pages. Numbers on one side, alien patterns on the other. He wasn't sure what that meant, and he wasn't sure he needed to. He turned out the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside, the farm was quiet. The stars moved overhead in their old, slow way. The spring peepers were going at the creek, their sound filling the warm April dark, the same way they filled it every year. The same way they had filled it for every spring of Earl's life, and his father's life, and his grandfather's first spring here in 1931, when the land was new broken and the future was just the next season. The way the future always was. Earl slept, the farm continued. That was the whole story. That was, perhaps, what the aliens had come so far to verify, that it was possible for the story to simply continue. That there existed, on at least this one small world, creatures who had figured out how to keep something going, past the point where keeping it made obvious sense, past the point where the numbers justified it, past the point where everything practical argued for letting go. They had come looking for a signal in the noise. They had found Earl Decker on a Tuesday in October, sitting on the floor of their ship with his hand on his cow's flank, saying, "I'm not leaving without her." That was the signal. That was the whole message, in a language older than language, a language that needed no translation because it was made of time and soil. And the same morning repeated 10,000 times. It said, "We are still here, we intend to stay, we know how to keep a thing." And from whatever distance they had traveled to hear it, the answer had been, "We hear you." We were wondering if anyone would say that. We came a very long way to find out.